What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're having a look at the unbelievable game played between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, and Hikaru Nakamura, his longtime rival, in the Freestyle Friday tournament. Yes, that's right. This is Fisher Random Chess. Let's dive right in. All right, this is Fisher Random Chess. So as you can see, the starting position here is all wacky wonky. The bishops are on the A files and the B files. The knights are on the C1 and D1 squares, and the rooks, queen, and king are all centered on the king side. All right, in the game, how does Magnus want to start this game? He opens 1c4 in the spirit of the English opening, but I do want to point out on move 1 right here, according to Stockfish, the strongest move is the move 1h4. And no, I am not joking. 1h4 is the strongest move on the board in this starting position. Instead of that, in the game, 1c4 chosen by Magnus, again, in the spirit of the English opening, and then we have 1c5 by Hikaru. Now here, Magnus, move 2, b3 is the weapon of choice, opening up that long diagonal for the artificially fianchettoed bishop. And here Hikaru does the same thing, b6, both sides activating their bishops on a1 and a8. Now here, knight to e3 chosen in the game by Magnus on move 3, but already on move 3, this turns out to be a massive mistake, as you can see by the eval bar collapsing on the left side of your screen. It's only move 3, and already Magnus has made a massive mistake. Instead of knight to e3, the right move here was f4 in the spirit of the bird's opening, moving that queen's pawn up to that queen's pawn up 2 squares. Instead, knight to e3 chosen in the game, and here Hikaru, he punishes this mistake immediately, and he goes for the move e6, threatening d5, expanding in the center, and already white is on the back foot. All right, here Magnus, d4 is the move, opening up the center. The point being, if black takes on d4, white will recapture with the bishop, and the bishop once again will be very active on this long diagonal. But here Hikaru, he is not phased. He just goes f5 in the spirit of the Dutch opening, gaining space on the king side. And believe it or not, Hikaru is actually threatening the move f4 here, gaining even more space and maybe starting a king side attack. All right, now Magnus, f4 is also the move. Now we have both of those queen's pawns moving down the board 2 squares, and these are queen's pawns as the queens are on the f1 and f8 squares. All right, now here, turns out the strongest move for black is just taking on d4, c takes d4, intending bishop takes, and then the alpha 0 move h5. Instead of that, in the game, knight to c6 chosen, and this looks logical enough. After all, you are putting more pressure on that pawn on d4, but here Magnus, he starts to fight back. He goes d5, gaining space in the center of the board and driving back that very vulnerable knight on f6. Where is that knight going to go? Well, in the game, it does jump forward to the d4 square, knight d4 chosen by Hikaru, and here, once again, according to the engine, again, the strongest move for white is the alpha 0 move h4, but instead, in the game, queen to f2 chosen, moving the queen up 1 square, very interesting, maybe intending perhaps queen f4, again, trying to get some sort of kingside attack going. We'll have to wait and see what Magnus has in mind with this move. All right, now Hikaru, knight to e7 is the move, centralizing that knight a little bit, trying to find a good square for it, and now we have the move knight d3, jumping up with the other knight and threatening ideas like knight to e5. How will Hikaru respond? Well, he also goes queen to f7, mirroring white's choice on the, 2 to 3 moves prior. Now here, the d pawns do get traded off the board. We have d takes e6, then d takes e6, and then knight to c2, dropping back with the knight and pressuring that weak knight on d4. Where is that knight going to go? Well, it turns out these knights will come flying off the board right here, right now. Knight takes c2, then bishop takes, and then knight to g6. And now finally, the moment we've all been waiting for. Both sides do unleash their alpha 0 h-pawns. h4 is the move for Magnus, threatening h5. That would be very, very dangerous. It is too dangerous. Therefore, Hikaru does go h5 in this position. And now, here in this position, this is really, really cool stuff. Both sides castle long here, but it is unlike anything you have ever seen. This is truly shocking. Are you ready? Here we go. Long castles, one more time. You move the king apparently 4 squares all the way to c1. Ready? Long castles, and black is going to do the exact same thing. Long castles, and the rook, shockingly, actually moves towards the queen side as well. That was pretty darn cool if you ask me. All right, now here, Magnus, rook to h3 is the move. The rook lift on the third rank, activating that rook. But now Hikaru, he just goes rook d7, intending rook h d8. And here Magnus says, you know what? Actually, I changed my mind. Rook to h1. He drops back the rook. He says rook h3 was not a good idea after all, and he does retreat it. Now, rook h d8 for Hikaru, doubling up rooks on the d file. Now, rook h d1, maybe intending a fast e4 break. We'll have to wait and see. And right now, we have a very, very interesting position for black. These bishops on a8 and b8 literally have not moved at all in the game. They're actually decently well placed on a8 and b8, but this knight on g6, that knight is not happy at all. White may want to go g3 later, maybe e4, and black may want to try to go e5 at some point. It's going to be really cool to see who can get their breaks in first in this game. All right, now here, Hikaru, bishop e4 is the move, clamping down on that e4 square, stopping the e4 advance permanently, or not permanently, but at least temporarily, while that piece is blockading that square. Now we have the move g3, finally, bolstering those pawns on h4 and f4. You gotta love it. Now knight d7. Hikaru says, you know what? That knight on g6, it is never, ever doing anything. And now the knight does have access to both c6, maybe intending knight d4, and also g8, intending knight f6, finally getting that knight back to a relatively normal square, at least normal according to, the standard chess starting position. All right, now knight b2 chosen in the game, dropping back that knight and opening up the attack on the bishop on e4. What will Hikaru do about it? Well, he ignores it and just goes knight to c6. Very interesting. Now, if white wants it, he can trade on e4, damaging black's pawn structure. But first, before doing that, he does trade one pair of rooks. So rook takes d7, then rook takes, and here Magnus gets a little bit trigger happy. He goes bishop takes e4, but this turns out to be a massive mistake despite looking very, very logical. The problem with this move, well, I'll show you in 1 second. Instead of that, the right move here, believe it or not, is knight to d1, retreating the knight and opening up the scope of the bishop on a1. And from there, you can go, for example, knight c3, knight e3, and so on, and you're doing just fine. Instead, though, in the game, bishop takes e4 chosen, then f takes, and then queen to e3. Again, piling up pressure on that weak pawn on e4, but again, it turns out knight c1 was the better option. And here, Hikaru, he just goes queen to f5, clamping down on that pawn on e4. That pawn on e4 is going nowhere, and here, suddenly, Hikaru has a massive advantage in this position. What is white going to do? All right, knight to a4 chosen in the game, jumping up with the knight, maybe intending knight c3, maybe then knight takes e4, but overall, this plan is very, very slow, and Hikaru has plenty of time to do almost whatever he wants, and it turns out he wants to go e5, finally breaking in the center, activating both the knight on c6 and the bishop on b8. Hikaru is just taking over in this game. Now we have f takes e5, then knight takes e5, knight to c3, dropping back with the knight, and here in this position, it turns out the strongest move for Hikaru is just knight g4, piling up pressure on that queen on e3, opening up the attack of the bishop on the pawn on g3, and so on. And if Hikaru finds that one simple move, knight to g4, he will be doing outstanding. But unfortunately, Hikaru, he does not find it. Instead, in the game, rook d4 chosen, and this turns out to be a massive mistake. Here, Magnus Carlsen, he just goes knight d5, threatening the royal fork on the queen and the king. And what is Hikaru going to do about it? Well, it turns out Hikaru has 18 seconds left on the clock. Versus the 3 seconds of Magnus, that is not a lot of time. What is Hikaru going to do? Well, in the game, he goes knight to g4. Hikaru, he ignores the threat of knight to e7 and instead goes knight g4, threatening the queen on e3. But this is a fatal mistake. And here, white has a choice between two incredibly strong moves. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the two strongest ideas right here for white. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, it turns out here in this position, the strongest move for white, believe it or not, is actually queen takes d4. The point being, after queen takes c takes, then you go knight e7, then knight takes f5 after the king moves, and overall you are up just a ton of material. Instead, in the game, knight e7 immediately chosen by Magnus, again forking the king and the queen, and this move is a little bit weaker than the alternative queen takes d4, as here black is going to recapture on e3, and you only win the knight instead of the rook. All right, knight e7, king b7, knight takes f5, knight takes e3, and then knight takes e3. The point being, in the other line, you do win that rook instead of the knight. Now, don't worry, white is still up massively here, and Carlsen should be winning this position, but at the same time, he only has 5 seconds left on the clock versus the 15 of Hikaru. Anything can happen here. All right, bishop takes g3, chosen in the game, pressuring the rook on e1. Then we have bishop takes d4, bishop takes e1, and bishop takes g7. Here, Magnus literally having an entire extra piece, that being that extra knight on e3. This should be more than enough for Magnus to win the game, but that being said, let's watch and see how it finishes. All right, bishop takes h4. Now the alpha 0 h pawn is officially a pass pawn. Here, Hikaru, all right, king d1 chosen in the game. Both sides still under extreme time pressure. Then bishop g5, knight f5, h4. The pawn does begin its march down the board. Then king to e1. Magnus knows you must get the king over to the defense of that pawn before it is too late. Now h3, that pawn is not slowing down. King to f1, and then king to c6. Now bishop h6 chosen in the game, offering the trade of those dark squared bishops. If those bishops come flying off the board, that is going to be effectively game over, as the extra knight will be too strong in the endgame. Now bishop f6 chosen, keeping that very important piece alive. Now bishop f4 dropping back and covering f2 in advance. Now b5, Hikaru, he is not done. He is not slowing down. He is opening up some lines of attack on the queen side. Now knight d6, jumping up with the knight. B takes c4, B takes c4, and then e3, clamping down in the center and trying to lock that king out of the game. Now here, Carlsen, we have knight to f5, then king b6, bishop takes e3, winning that pawn on the e3 square, bishop e5. Hikaru is fighting on until the bitter end in this game. Knight to h4, bishop d6, dropping back with the bishop, knight f5, jumping up, again pressuring that weak bishop on d6. Now bishop f8, the bishop retreats, and now is the knight dominating the bishop, or is the bishop dominating the knight? I don't know. Tell me in the chat which one it is, and let's keep going. Now here, is the knight dominating the bishop, or is the bishop dominating the knight? I'm not sure which one it is. Either way, let me know in the comment section below, and let's keep going. Knight g3 chosen by Carlsen, then king to a5. The king march begins. The king, believe it or not, is targeting the weak pawn on a2. Now a3, king to a4, knight to e4, and king takes a3. Hikaru winning yet another alpha 0 pawn on the edge of the board. Now knight takes c5, king to b4, targeting the knight on c5 and the pawn on c4, knight to e6, bishop e7, bishop takes a7, king takes c4, knight to f4, and now h2. Can white stop the alpha 0 pawn on h2? Well, it turns out, yes, he can. King g2, not a very hard move to find. Bishop d6, that pressures the knight on f4. Now we have bishop to e3, defends the knight, king to c3, king takes h2, and bishop c7. Now, very importantly, if white loses that pawn on e2, yes, technically white can win with the bishop and the knight, but it is a very, very complicated win. And to be honest, with just 5 seconds left on the clock, I'm not sure if even Carlsen himself could pull it off. Therefore, if Hikaru wins that pawn on e2, it may actually be a draw after all. All right, king g2 chosen in the game, bishop b8, king f3, king c4, bishop f2, dropping that bishop back and setting up e4 ideas. Now king b5, e4, king c6, knight d5, bishop to d6, bishop g3, bishop a3, king g4, bishop b2, guarding that e5 square. Again, if white goes e5, black can literally take on e5, and even if he wasn't winning the knight outright, it could still be a draw, as again, the bishop and knight endgame is very, very hard to win as white. All right, king to f5 chosen in the game, king c5, bishop e5, offering that bishop trade, and now very importantly, if Hikaru trades on e5, that will be a one endgame for white. There will be no stopping that pawn on e4. Now bishop a3 chosen in the game, bishop f6, king c4, knight e3 hits the king, king d3 targets the knight, knight g4, bishop d6, and finally in this position, bishop g5 chosen by Magnus. And in this position, Hikaru, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen, and here's why. There's simply nothing stopping e5, e6, e7, and so on that would effectively win the game on the spot, and therefore Hikaru, he simply tips his hat to Magnus and resigns on the spot. But I do want to point out, if we are keeping score, Hikaru Nakamura in freestyle chess at this game, when this game was played, as an ELO of 29.39 versus just 29.14 of Magnus Carlsen, and that does mean Hikaru, I guess, in freestyle chess is a teensy-weensy tiny bit better than Magnus. That is not something I expected. Very interesting. So, how about that? All right, wow, what a game between Magnus and Hikaru in the Freestyle Friday tournament. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this Freestyle Friday game. I mean, it's kind of a new thing, so I'm trying to cover the latest Freestyle Friday games if they feature Magnus or Hikaru or Hans or any of the big players. So I'm curious if you guys enjoy these games as much as the typical games. I mean, the starting position here was just like ridiculous. The bishop's on a1 and b1, the knight's on c1, d1, the rook's queen, king over here. And how about that? Stockfish saying 1h4 is actually the strongest move in the position. And no, I'm not kidding. Look at the eval bar, 0.44. You play h4 and it still stays roughly the same. I mean, how about that? 1h4 being the strongest move in this position. So very interesting stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. And if you want to see more Freestyle Friday, check out this game right here where I covered the game between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, where I don't want to ruin it for you, but that game was a shocker as well. So check that game out and I'll see you in the next video.